December 19th, 2022. A private clinic in the 16th arrondissement of Paris where white orchids stood sentinel beside a woman who had spent 93 years being called the most elegant creature on earth. Jacqueline de Ribes, the woman Diana Vreeland once crowned the last queen of elegance, lay with her Balenciaga gloves folded like armor beside her pillow. In her hand, a letter she would never send, beginning with words that would haunt the fashion world. I designed my own mask to survive, but I forgot how to take it off. The nurses whispered that even in her final moments, the Comtesse had refused to be seen without her signature red lipstick, Chanel Rouge Coco in Gabrielle, applied with the precision of a master painter completing a final brushstroke. Her personal maid, Marie-Claire, who had served the family for 30 years, later revealed that Madame had insisted on wearing her emerald Cartier earrings, gifts from her husband on their silver anniversary, because a lady must always be properly dressed for her final appearance. When the news broke 6 hours later, it traveled through the fashion world like a seismic shock. From the ateliers of the Rue Saint-Honoré to the editorial offices of Vogue Paris, from the salons of the Upper East Side to the showrooms of Milan, the same phrase echoed, "The last of the great ones is gone." The world mourned not just a woman, but the end of an impossible dream. That someone could live as pure art, untouched by the messiness of ordinary human existence. But as photographers gathered outside her mansion on Place des Vosges, the same building where Victor Hugo had once lived, one question echoed through marble halls where she had entertained Andy Warhol and Henry Kissinger, Rothschilds and Rockefellers, where Grace Kelly had sought advice on royal protocol, and where Audrey Hepburn had come for comfort after her divorce. Was Jacqueline de Ribes ever more than the exquisite mask she created? What if the woman the world had worshipped as the ultimate expression of authentic elegance had been performing a role so long that she had forgotten where the performance ended and the person began? But to understand how the mask became the woman, we must first understand how the woman became the mask. July 14th, 1929, Bastille Day. As fireworks exploded over Paris, celebrating the overthrow of one aristocracy, another was quietly crumbling behind the limestone walls of Avenue Foch. Jacqueline de Beaumont entered a world where her family's ancient name, traceable to the court of Louis XIV, meant more than her father's depleted bank account, where appearances were maintained through sheer willpower and borrowed couture. The de Beaumont mansion was a mausoleum of faded grandeur. Silk wallpaper hung in tatters behind carefully positioned furniture, and the family's Sèvres porcelain collection had been quietly sold piece by piece to pay for the illusion of continued prosperity. Count Henri de Beaumont, a man who spoke 5 languages but had never held a job, measured worth in centuries rather than francs. He would spend hours in his study, surrounded by genealogical charts that traced the family lineage back to Charlemagne, as if noble blood could somehow pay the mounting bills. Countess Simone drifted through their mansion like a ghost draped in pre-war Chanel, teaching her daughter that silence was golden and emotions were for servants. She had been a celebrated beauty in her youth, painted by Giovanni Boldini and courted by Russian princes, but marriage to Henri had transformed her into something ethereal and distant. "A lady never raises her voice," she would tell young Jacqueline. "A lady never shows her feelings. A lady is always a performance." By age 5, little Jacqueline had learned to move like liquid mercury, to smile without revealing teeth, to transform herself into living porcelain whenever adults appeared. Her nursery was decorated with paintings of aristocratic children from previous centuries, pale, formal little figures in elaborate dress who seemed to stare down at her with expectations of perfection. The child quickly understood that she was meant to be not just well-behaved, but a work of art in human form. The first sign of what was to come appeared in her childhood bedroom. Dozens of dolls dressed in elaborate gowns she had sewn from fabric scraps stolen from her mother's dressmaker. Each tiny dress was a masterpiece of precision. Miniature ball gowns with hand-sewn beading, afternoon ensembles with matching accessories, evening wear with trains that could be arranged in perfect folds. It was as if the child was already rehearsing for a lifetime of being dressed by others, of becoming beautiful, rather than simply being human. Her governess, Mademoiselle Dubois, a severe Breton woman who had previously served the Russian aristocracy before the revolution, would find her charge standing before a three-way mirror for hours, adjusting collars with the intensity of a scientist perfecting an experiment. Posture, Jacqueline. A lady never slouches. Chin up, shoulders back. You are not just representing yourself, you carry the weight of centuries. But it was more than posture being drilled into the child. It was the fundamental understanding that she was not just a person, but a vessel for something larger, something that demanded absolute dedication to an impossible ideal. The education of Jacqueline de Beaumont was conducted not in classrooms, but in drawing rooms, where she learned to speak perfect English from an exiled British duchess, to play Chopin from a Russian émigré who had once performed for the Tsar, and to move with grace from a former prima ballerina of the Opéra de Paris. Every skill was designed to transform her into the perfect ornament for high society, a living embodiment of aristocratic refinement. Could these early lessons in performance have been preparing her for a life where authenticity would become the ultimate luxury she could never afford? When war came in 1940, 11-year-old Jacqueline was evacuated to the family chateau in Normandy, a medieval fortress that had been in the de Beaumont family for 400 years. Here, surrounded by portraits of ancestors who had survived the French Revolution, the wars of religion, and countless political upheavals, she spent 4 years learning that survival sometimes required the most exquisite performance of all: grace under pressure. The chateau became her classroom in the art of beautiful deception. While German officers were billeted in the nearby village, while food became scarce and winter nights stretched endlessly without heat, Jacqueline watched her mother maintain perfect tea service as if nothing had changed, speaking in carefully modulated tones that revealed nothing of the family's fear or desperation. The child learned to set a table with museum-quality precision even when the meal consisted of turnip soup and black bread, to arrange flowers with artistic flair even when the only blooms were weeds from the kitchen garden. During those war years, Jacqueline's only companion was her great-aunt Marguerite, a woman who had been a legendary beauty during the Belle Époque, and who regaled her grandniece with stories of the lost world of pre-war Paris. "Elegance, ma chérie," the old woman would say as she taught Jacqueline to glide down the chateau's grand staircase, "is not about money or even about beauty. It is about creating magic, about making people believe in something more beautiful than reality." These words would echo in Jacqueline's mind for the rest of her life, shaping her understanding that she was not meant to be a person but a dream made flesh. The war years also revealed young Jacqueline's almost supernatural ability to transform herself. Local villagers would later recall seeing the little Countess at church services, sitting ramrod straight in the family pew, her simple dress somehow looking more elegant than the finest Parisian couture. Even as a child, she possessed what photographers would later call the gift, the ability to make any space, any moment, any photograph more beautiful simply by being present within it. When Paris was liberated in 1944, 15-year-old Jacqueline returned to find a city where the old rules no longer applied. The aristocracy was scrambling to redefine itself in a world that had moved on, where titles meant nothing without the money to support them. But young Jacqueline seemed to possess an intuitive understanding that the future belonged not to those who owned beautiful things, but to those who could become beautiful things themselves. The post-war Paris that welcomed her back was a city of contradictions. While the rubble was being cleared and the monuments restored, a new kind of society was emerging, one where talent and charisma mattered more than bloodlines, where Americans with new money rubbed shoulders with European nobility trying to cling to old traditions. It was into this transformed world that Jacqueline would make her debut, armed with nothing but her family's name, her mother's connections, and an instinctive understanding of how to become unforgettable. Her preparation for society was conducted like a military campaign. Madame Dubois, now serving as her personal secretary, scheduled fittings with the few couturiers the family could still afford, arranged French lessons with native speakers to eliminate any trace of regional accent, and coordinated dancing lessons with the former choreographer of the Ballet Russes. Every detail was planned with the precision of a museum exhibition, because that's essentially what Jacqueline's debut would be. The unveiling of a work of art that had taken 18 years to create. Her debut at 18 marked the birth of what society columnists would call the de Ribes phenomenon. The 1947 ball at Versailles, staged to coincide with the 10th anniversary of Christian Dior's revolutionary new look, became fashion legend not because of the clothes or the setting, but because of what happened when one perfectly prepared young woman descended a marble staircase. Jacqueline's dress that evening had been commissioned from Madame Gray, the Greek-born designer known for her ability to drape fabric like ancient sculpture. The gown, ivory silk jersey that seemed to flow like liquid marble, had cost the de Beaumont family their last valuable painting, a small Renoir that had hung in the library for 3 generations. But as Jacqueline appeared at the top of the Versailles staircase, every person in the ballroom understood that they were witnessing something unprecedented. She moved like she was already famous, remembered Countess Marie-Laure de Polignac decades later. Like she understood that she was meant to be looked at, studied, remembered. But even witnesses noted something unsettling. While Jacqueline posed flawlessly for the society photographers documenting the evening, she seemed more present in the pictures than at the actual party, as if she existed more fully when filtered through a camera lens than in real life. The transformation was instantaneous and complete. By the end of that evening, every major fashion magazine had requested interviews, 3 different designers had offered to dress her exclusively, and 5 of Europe's most eligible bachelors had asked for introductions. But perhaps the most telling response came from Cecil Beaton, the legendary photographer who approached her during the evening and said simply, "My dear, you are not just beautiful. You are a photograph waiting to happen." Marriage to banker Edouard de Ribes in 1948 provided the financial foundation for her transformation into something unprecedented, a woman famous for being flawlessly, impossibly elegant. Their courtship was conducted entirely in public at gallery openings, opera premieres, diplomatic receptions. Even their most intimate moments seemed choreographed for an invisible audience. When they married in a ceremony that made the cover of Life magazine, the headline read, "The Perfect French Wedding." Fool. But those close to the couple noted that the bride and groom rarely looked at each other during the ceremony. They were both too busy looking at the cameras. Marriage to Edouard provided more than financial security. It offered access to a social world where Jacqueline could complete her metamorphosis from aristocratic ingénue to international icon. The de Ribes fortune, built on 3 generations of successful banking, meant that money would never again be an obstacle to perfection. More importantly, Edouard's business connections introduced Jacqueline to a circle of influence that extended far beyond traditional European society. Their salon on Place des Vosges became legendary within months of their marriage. The apartment itself was a masterpiece of understated luxury, Napoleon III furniture mixed with contemporary art, Aubusson tapestries alongside works by Picasso and Matisse. Antique Sèvres porcelain displayed next to modern sculpture by Arp and Calder. But the real attraction was Jacqueline herself, who had developed the ability to make every gathering feel both intimate and significant. The guest lists for de Ribes dinner parties read like a directory of mid-century cultural influence. Jean Cocteau debating aesthetics with Cecil Beaton, Coco Chanel dispensing wisdom to younger designers, Diana Vreeland discovering new talents alongside established masters. Politicians, artists, writers, and industrialists all competed for invitations to evenings where the hostess herself was the primary entertainment. Not because she performed, but because she had become performance itself. The 1950s and 60s witnessed Jacqueline's metamorphosis from socialite to icon, from person to symbol. She appeared on best-dressed lists not once, but every year for 3 decades, her name becoming synonymous with a particular kind of effortless sophistication that seemed to exist outside of time itself. Fashion magazines competed to photograph her, designers fought to dress her, and society columnists chronicled her every appearance as if documenting the movements of a rare and exotic creature. But it was her relationships with the great couturiers of the era that truly elevated her from muse to myth. These were not simply client relationships, but collaborations between artists. One who worked in fabric, the other who worked in flesh and bone. Each designer saw in Jacqueline the perfect canvas for their vision, and she in turn understood how to inhabit their creations so completely that she became indistinguishable from the art itself. Yves Saint Laurent, then a young assistant to Christian Dior, would later describe his first encounter with Jacqueline. She walked into the atelier like a goddess descending from Mount Olympus. Not because she was beautiful, though she was breathtaking, but because she moved with such absolute confidence in her own perfection that you forgot she was human. She was the dress before I even designed it. Their collaboration began in 1958 when Saint Laurent, newly appointed as Dior's successor, created his first collection with Jacqueline as his primary inspiration. The relationship between designer and muse reached its apex with Saint Laurent's legendary Mondrian collection of 1965. The geometric dresses that would define a decade were reportedly conceived after Saint Laurent spent an afternoon watching Jacqueline move through her apartment, observing how she transformed static space into dynamic composition simply by existing within it. She was already abstract art, he would later explain. I simply provided the framework. Hubert de Givenchy's association with Jacqueline began even before his famous partnership with Audrey Hepburn. The aristocratic designer, who understood the codes of European high society in ways that even Chanel never mastered, recognized in Jacqueline a woman who could elevate clothes beyond fashion into the realm of cultural statement. Their fitting sessions, conducted in Givenchy's private atelier, became legendary among fashion insiders for their intensity and duration, sometimes lasting 6 hours as designer and client worked together to achieve not just perfect fit, but perfect meaning. Jacqueline taught me that elegance is not about the dress, Givenchy would reflect decades later. It is about the woman's relationship to the dress, the way she makes it seem inevitable rather than chosen. She never wore my clothes. She became them. The most famous result of their collaboration was the white silk evening gown Jacqueline wore to the 1962 state dinner for President Kennedy. A dress so perfectly proportioned and exquisitely simple that it appeared in every major fashion magazine and was later acquired by the Metropolitan Museum of Art as an example of perfection in dress. But it was her relationship with Cristobal Balenciaga that revealed the true extent of Jacqueline's transformation from person to artwork. The Spanish master, known for his almost religious approach to couture and his hatred of publicity, made an exception for Jacqueline that he extended to no other client. She was invited to his private atelier not just for fittings but for what he called conversations in cloth, sessions where designer and muse would spend hours exploring the philosophical implications of cut, line, and proportion. Balenciaga's notes from these sessions, discovered after his death, reveal the depth of their artistic collaboration. Jacqueline understands what very few women comprehend. That perfect dress exists not to make woman beautiful, but to make beautiful woman disappear into pure aesthetic experience. She wears my clothes not as costume, but as second skin, not as ornament, but as architecture of the soul. The most iconic result of their partnership was the black silk coat that Jacqueline wore to the funeral of President Kennedy in 1963. Standing beside Jackie Kennedy in the receiving line at the White House, the two most photographed women in the world presented a study in contrasts, one representing American glamour and accessibility, the other embodying European sophistication and mystery. Balenciaga had designed Jacqueline's coat specifically for this moment, understanding that she would be photographed not just as a mourner but as a representative of old-world elegance paying respects to new-world tragedy. But it was photographer Irving Penn who captured the essential truth about Jacqueline de Ribes in a series of portraits taken between 1962 and 1967. Penn, known for his ability to reveal the inner lives of his subjects, found in Jacqueline something unprecedented. A woman who had achieved such perfect control over her image that she had become, in effect, her own greatest creation. She would step in front of my camera as one person and emerge as someone else entirely, Penn later described. Someone more beautiful, more mysterious, more perfect. It was like watching a magic trick, except I was never sure which version was the illusion. The woman who entered my studio or the goddess who appeared in the photographs. The Penn portraits show Jacqueline in various states of formal undress, sometimes in elaborate evening gowns, sometimes in simple black dresses, occasionally wearing nothing but jewelry and shadows. But in every image she appears to exist in a realm beyond ordinary human experience, as if she had discovered the secret of transcending flesh and becoming pure aesthetic essence. Fashion critic Diana Vreeland, who collaborated with Penn on many of these sessions, wrote in her memoirs, "Jacqueline de Ribes doesn't wear clothes. She inhabits them like a ghost inhabits a house, completely and mysteriously, with an elegance that suggests she might disappear at any moment." Watching her pose for Irving was like watching a master class in the art of becoming unforgettable. Behind the glittering surface, however, those closest to her began to notice troubling signs. Friends reported that Jacqueline had developed an obsession with perfection that bordered on the pathological. Her personal maid revealed that Madame kept detailed notebooks about every outfit worn to every event, cross-referenced with guest lists and photographers present, ensuring she never repeated a look in front of the same people. The system had grown so complex that it required a full-time secretary just to maintain the records. More disturbing was her increasing tendency to speak about herself in the third person during private conversations. Jacqueline would never wear yellow, she might tell her dressmaker, as if discussing a character she was hired to portray rather than expressing personal preference. Jacqueline doesn't dance at parties. She only watches, she would explain to hosts who wondered why she never joined in the festivities she attended so religiously. Close friends began to whisper about the Comtesse's strange habits, how she practiced facial expressions in mirrors for hours before public appearances, how she rehearsed conversations with imaginary interlocutors, how she seemed incapable of any spontaneous gesture or unguarded moment. The woman who had been celebrated for her natural elegance was revealing herself to be the product of almost inhuman self-discipline and control. The first crack in the perfect facade appeared in 1965 when candid photographs surfaced of Jacqueline leaving a private clinic in Gstaad, Switzerland. The images, taken by a paparazzi photographer and published in a German tabloid, showed a woman who looked exhausted, almost fragile, being helped into a car by medical personnel. The official story, released through the de Ribes family's publicity representative, was exhaustion brought on by an overly demanding social schedule. But whispers circulated through Parisian society about something more serious. Sources close to the family revealed that Jacqueline had been seeing Dr. Elizabeth Kubler-Ross, the Swiss-American psychiatrist who had begun pioneering work on what was then called identity displacement disorder, the condition of becoming so thoroughly identified with a public persona that the authentic self disappears entirely. The real scandal erupted not from tabloid speculation but from Jacqueline's own words. At a dinner party in 1966 hosted by art dealer Daniel Henry Conweiler, she made a confession that would shatter her perfect image and begin the most difficult chapter of her life. The gathering was small and intimate. Just 8 guests, including Picasso, Man Ray, and several prominent collectors. And the conversation had turned to the relationship between art and identity. "Sometimes," Jacqueline said, her voice barely audible above the gentle clink of crystal glasses, "I wake up every morning and have to remind myself who I'm supposed to be that day. Sometimes I look in the mirror and see a beautiful stranger wearing my face." The table fell silent. Here was the woman who had been held up as the ultimate example of authentic elegance, admitting that she no longer knew where performance ended and person began. When those words appeared in Les Temps Modernes, Jean-Paul Sartre's influential literary magazine, the fashion world reeled. The reaction was swift and devastating. Society photographers who had once competed for her attention began describing her as cold, calculated, more mannequin than woman. Fashion critics wrote harsh pieces about the Ice Queen of Paris, suggesting that her legendary elegance was nothing more than an elaborate form of emotional bankruptcy. The defining moment came at the 1967 Met Gala, an event that was supposed to mark Jacqueline's triumphant return to public life after months of private struggle and therapeutic work. The theme was fashion and time, and Jacqueline had commissioned Balenciaga to create what was intended to be the ultimate expression of timeless elegance. A gown that would silence her critics and re-establish her position as the undisputed queen of international society. The dress itself was a masterpiece that had taken 6 months to create. White silk file constructed with mathematical precision, embellished with pearls that had been individually sewn by hand, cut in lines so pure and perfect that it transformed the human body into a piece of living sculpture. When Jacqueline arrived at the Metropolitan Museum that evening, stepping from her limousine onto the red carpet, the crowd of photographers and onlookers fell silent. But something went wrong. As she approached the museum's entrance facing the battery of cameras that had gathered to document her return to glory, Jacqueline simply froze. For 5 endless minutes, an eternity in the accelerated world of fashion photography, she stood motionless on the museum steps while hundreds of guests watched in uncomfortable silence. Witnesses described the scene as surreal and heartbreaking. Here was the woman who had been celebrated for her ability to transform any moment into magic, standing like a statue while the very perfection that had made her famous seemed to consume her from within. The photographs from that evening show a figure of unearthly beauty suspended in a moment of absolute stillness, as if she had achieved the ultimate artistic statement, becoming so perfectly elegant that she had transcended humanity itself. The image that emerged from that evening, a woman frozen in her own perfection, became both the culmination and the epitaph of the de Ribes myth. Fashion critics would later write about the Met Gala incident as the moment when the cult of perfection revealed its true cost, when the world finally understood that the woman they had worshipped as the ultimate expression of authentic elegance had been performing a role that had gradually consumed the person who played it. Had the mask finally consumed the woman who wore it, or was this the moment she began fighting back? Did this tragic event mark their downfall, or was it simply the moment when the performance became too heavy to bear? The woman who eventually emerged from her self-imposed exile was fundamentally different from the icon who had disappeared. After 18 months of intensive therapy with Dr. Kubler-Ross, supplemented by long periods of solitude at the family chateau in Normandy, Jacqueline began the painstaking work of rediscovering who she might be when no one was watching. The process was neither quick nor easy. Dr. Kubler-Ross's notes from this period reveal the unique challenge of treating someone whose identity had become so thoroughly externalized. Patient must learn to recognize her own emotions, which have been suppressed for so long that they present as foreign sensations. Simple questions such as, "What do you want for lunch?" produces anxiety because she has spent decades responding only to what others expect her to want. Gradually, friends began reporting sightings of a different Jacqueline, a woman who appeared at small private gatherings wearing simple black dresses instead of her signature haute couture, speaking in her natural voice rather than the carefully modulated tones that had made her famous. She began painting. Badly, she would joke to intimates, and reading poetry aloud to herself, trying to reconnect with parts of her personality that had been buried beneath decades of perfect performance. But the real breakthrough came in 1972 with a decision that shocked the fashion world and marked the beginning of Jacqueline's transformation from icon to artist. After decades of being dressed by others, she announced her intention to become a designer herself, launching her own couture house on the Rue du Faubourg Saint-Honoré. The establishment was skeptical. How could someone who had never formally studied design, who had been famous primarily for wearing clothes rather than creating them, suddenly compete with the masters who had made her famous? The fashion press treated the announcement with barely concealed condescension, suggesting that this was merely the latest eccentricity of a woman who had already proven her disconnection from reality. But Jacqueline's first collection, shown in February 1973 in a small salon that seated barely 50 people, revealed that her years of being fitted by the world's greatest couturiers had given her an intuitive understanding of construction and proportion that couldn't be taught in any design school. More importantly, her clothes possessed something that had been missing from her public persona for years: genuine emotion. The collection consisted of just 12 pieces, but each one told a story about the relationship between clothing and identity, between performance and authenticity. There were day dresses that suggested confidence without aggression, evening gowns that projected elegance without coldness, coats that provided protection without concealment. The clothes seemed designed for women who, like herself, were learning to navigate the space between public expectation and private truth. "These are clothes for women who want to be seen," wrote fashion critic Susie Menkes in her review, "but who also want to be known." Jacqueline de Ribes has somehow managed to create garments that reveal rather than conceal, that enhance personality rather than replace it. "Elegance is not about being noticed," she began telling clients who came to her atelier seeking not just beautiful clothes, but guidance on how to use fashion as a tool for self-discovery rather than self-erasure. "It is about being remembered. But first, you must remember yourself." The irony was profound and not lost on fashion critics. The woman who had once been criticized for her emotional unavailability had become one of the industry's most insightful counselors on the psychology of dress. Her appointment book filled with women seeking not just couture but consultation, hoping to learn from someone who had traveled the full journey from performance to authenticity. In a rare television interview conducted in 1987 for French television, Jacqueline addressed decades of speculation about her transformation with characteristic directness. Society was my prison. Fashion was my freedom. But I confused freedom with escape, and I spent many years running away from myself in the most beautiful clothes imaginable. Only when I began creating clothes for other women did I finally learn to create myself. Her design philosophy, refined over years of working with clients who ranged from nervous debutantes to confident dowagers, was revolutionary in its simplicity. Clothes should serve the woman, not the other way around. Each piece was created not to transform the wearer into someone else, but to help her become more fully herself. Can anyone ever truly escape from the shadow of their darkest moments? In Jacqueline's case, the answer seemed to be not escape, but integration. Learning to be both the icon and the woman, the mask and the face beneath it. As she entered her 90s, Jacqueline had achieved something rarer than fame, the integration of public image and private reality. She divided her time between her Paris atelier and the Normandy chateau where she had first learned to perform perfection, but now the performance was of her own creation rather than others' expectations. Her final years were marked by a series of intimate gatherings where she shared the wisdom gained from her journey through the looking glass of fame and back again. Young designers, fashion students, and cultural critics would make pilgrimages to Place des Vosges to hear her speak about the relationship between beauty and truth, between style and soul. "I spent so many years being what everyone wanted me to be," she reflected in one of her last recorded interviews, "that I forgot what I wanted for myself. The tragedy is not that I became an image. The tragedy is that I thought the image was more valuable than the person. It took me 60 years to learn that elegance without authenticity is just elaborate emptiness." When Jacqueline de Ribes died on December 19, 2022, the fashion world lost more than an icon. It lost the last authentic connection to an era when elegance was considered a form of high art, and when certain women were expected to embody beauty so completely that they became living sculptures. Her death marked not just the end of a life, but the end of an era, the closing of a chapter in the history of style that could never be written again. The funeral arrangements themselves reflected the duality she had finally learned to master. The public ceremony at Saint-Sulpice drew designers, society figures, and cultural luminaries from around the world. Karl Lagerfeld's successor at Chanel, the current creative directors of Dior and Saint Laurent, museum curators and fashion historians who understood they were witnessing the end of an epoch. But the private burial at the family cemetery in Normandy was attended only by family and a handful of close friends, who had known not the icon, but the woman who had finally learned to exist without an audience. The contrast between these two ceremonies, one a spectacular performance, the other an intimate farewell, seemed to capture everything about Jacqueline's long journey from performance to authenticity. In the months following her death, the discovery of her private papers revealed the extent to which she had been consciously crafting not just her image but her legacy. Letters to close friends showed that she had been acutely aware of her role as the last of her kind, and had deliberately chosen to embody certain dying traditions of European aristocratic elegance, even when doing so came at an enormous personal cost. More controversial were the revelations contained in Dr. Kubler-Ross's clinical notes, made public with the family's permission as part of a scholarly study on identity and celebrity. The psychiatrist's files included detailed recordings of therapy sessions in which Jacqueline spoke about feeling like an actress who had been performing the same role for so long that she had forgotten it was just a performance. These revelations sparked intense debate within fashion circles about the ethics of creating living icons and the responsibility of the fashion industry to the women who serve as its muses. Some critics argued that Jacqueline de Ribes had been as much a victim of the fashion system as a beneficiary of it, transformed into a beautiful object rather than celebrated as a complex human being. Others pointed to her later years as evidence of her ultimate triumph over the forces that had threatened to consume her. Her successful transition from muse to designer, from icon to counselor, from performer to authentic person, demonstrated a resilience and self-awareness that challenged assumptions about the women who had served as fashion's most visible symbols. The Jacqueline de Ribes Foundation, established according to her will, continues to operate from her former atelier on Rue du Faubourg Saint-Honoré. The foundation provides grants for young designers, funds research into the psychological impact of fashion on identity formation, and maintains an archive of her designs that scholars use to study the evolution of couture in the latter half of the 20th century. Her fashion house continues under the direction of 3 designers she personally trained, all of whom had worked with her for more than 20 years. They maintain her philosophy that clothes should serve to reveal rather than conceal, to enhance rather than replace, to support rather than dominate the women who wear them. But perhaps Jacqueline's most lasting legacy lies in the questions her life raised about the nature of beauty, performance, and authenticity in an increasingly image-obsessed culture. In an era when social media has made performers of us all, when the line between public and private self has been virtually obliterated, when everyone curates their image with the intensity once reserved for movie stars and fashion icons, her story serves as both cautionary tale and inspiration. The Metropolitan Museum's permanent collection now includes 12 pieces from Jacqueline's design work, displayed alongside examples from Balenciaga, Saint Laurent, and Givenchy. The masters who had once dressed her now sharing space with her own creations. The wall text accompanying the exhibition reads, "These garments represent not just the evolution of an individual style, but the transformation of a woman from artwork to artist, from object to subject, from performer to author of her own performance." In fashion schools around the world, students study the de Ribes paradox, the question of how someone could be both the ultimate expression of authentic style and the most elaborate construction of artificial perfection. Her life has become a case study in the psychology of image, the sociology of celebrity, and the philosophy of identity in the modern world. The last word, perhaps, should go to Jacqueline herself, from the letter found in her hand at the time of her death. "I designed my own mask to survive, but I forgot how to take it off. In the end, perhaps that was my greatest achievement. Not the elegance that made me famous, but the humanity I finally found beneath all those beautiful clothes." The question is not whether to perform. We are all performing all the time. The question is whether to perform ourselves or someone else's idea of who we should be. In a world where Instagram filters and TikTok personas have made mask-wearing universal, where everyone curates their image with an intensity that would have been familiar to Jacqueline in her prime, her journey from prisoner to master of her own performance feels more relevant than ever. She remains both inspiration and warning. Proof that it is possible to transcend the roles that others assign to us, but also evidence of the terrible cost of forgetting who we are beneath the roles we choose to play. Was Jacqueline de Ribes the last great aristocratic muse of couture, a relic of a more elegant age when style mattered more than substance? Or was she the first to understand something essential about modern existence? That in a world of constant performance, true elegance lies not in perfect presentation, but in the courage to be imperfectly, authentically human. What masks are we wearing today, and like Jacqueline, have we forgotten how to take them off? Were these final decisions acts of surrender or courageous acts of self-preservation?